She said it over dessert. I wish you were never born. Everyone laughed, except me. I put my fork down slowly. My heart was racing, but I smiled. Then I said my one line. The room went dead silent. She never spoke to me again. I walked out. I was 32 years old, sitting at my mother's dining room table for what I didn't know would be the last time for years. Let me back up. My name is Sarah, and I'm the middle child of 3 daughters. My older sister Jessica has always been the golden child. She's a successful lawyer, married to a doctor named Robert, with 2 perfect kids and a house in the suburbs that looks like it belongs in a magazine. My younger sister Amanda is the baby, the creative one who can do no wrong in my parents' eyes despite being 28 and still living in their basement while pursuing her art career. Then there's me. I'm a high school English teacher, divorced, no kids, living in a modest apartment across town. I'm not unsuccessful by any normal standards, but in my family, I've always felt invisible. The forgotten middle child who never quite measured up to Jessica's achievements or Amanda's artistic soul. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration of Jessica's latest promotion to senior partner at her law firm. Mom had gone all out, her best china, homemade lasagna, the works. Dad was beaming with pride as Jessica regaled us with stories of her courtroom victories and the new BMW she was considering buying. Amanda was showing off her latest paintings on her phone, and everyone was oohing and awing over her unique perspective and raw talent. Meanwhile, I mentioned that one of my students had won a regional writing contest that I'd helped coach her for, and it barely registered a polite nod from anyone. This was nothing new. I'd grown used to being the afterthought, the reliable one who showed up to every family gathering, brought thoughtful gifts, remembered birthdays, and listened to everyone else's problems without complaint. I was the designated caretaker of family harmony, always smoothing over conflicts and making sure everyone felt heard and valued. Except I never felt heard or valued myself. The conversation at dinner followed its usual pattern. Jessica talked about her work, her husband Mark's new position at the hospital, their daughter Emma's acceptance into a gifted program, and their son Tyler's soccer achievements. Amanda discussed her latest creative project, a series of abstract paintings about the intersection of trauma and healing that she was hoping to show at a local gallery. When the conversation briefly turned to me, I mentioned that I was considering going back to school for my master's degree in education administration, maybe moving into a leadership role eventually. Oh, that's nice, honey, Mom said absently, already turning back to Jessica. Jess, tell us more about that case you won last week. I felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but I pushed it down like always. I'd learned long ago not to expect too much attention or praise from my family. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was secure in my own worth and didn't need their validation. But then came dessert. Mom had made her famous chocolate cake, the same one she'd been making for special occasions since we were kids. As she served generous slices to everyone, the conversation turned to childhood memories. Jessica and Amanda were laughing about some prank they'd pulled when they were teenagers, a story I'd heard a dozen times before. Remember when we convinced Sarah that she was adopted? Amanda giggled, taking a big bite of cake. Everyone laughed except me. I remembered that joke all too well. I was 12, going through an awkward phase, feeling insecure and out of place. My sisters had spent weeks dropping hints that I was adopted, pointing out how different I looked from them, how my interests were different, how I didn't really fit with the family. It had devastated me at the time. I cried myself to sleep for weeks, wondering if it was true, feeling even more like an outsider than I already did. When I finally worked up the courage to ask our parents, they'd laughed it off as harmless sibling teasing. No one seemed to understand how deeply it had hurt me. That was so mean of you girls, Mom said now, but she was smiling as she said it. Poor Sarah was so upset. She was so gullible, Jessica added, shaking her head. She actually believed us for months. It was harmless fun, Dad chimed in. Kids will be kids. I forced a smile and took a bite of cake, even though it tasted like cardboard in my mouth. This was how it always went. My pain was minimized, dismissed as overreaction or hypersensitivity. I was expected to laugh along with jokes at my expense, to be the good sport who could take it all in stride. The conversation continued, more childhood stories, more laughter at my expense. The time they'd convinced me that if I made a certain face it would stick that way permanently. The time they told me that the ice cream truck only played music when it was out of ice cream. The time they'd hidden all my stuffed animals and told me they'd run away because I wasn't taking good enough care of them. Each story was told with fond amusement, as if these were cherished family memories rather than a systematic pattern of psychological torment that had shaped my childhood and my sense of self-worth. I sat there, my fork moving mechanically from plate to mouth, feeling smaller and smaller with each anecdote. This was my family. These were the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally, and yet they seemed to take genuine pleasure in recounting all the ways they'd made me miserable as a child. Then Amanda said it. She was laughing particularly hard at some story about how they'd convinced me that I could only speak on weekends when I was 7, which had resulted in me being completely silent at school for 3 days before my teacher called home in concern, when she suddenly looked at me with that expression I knew so well, the one that meant she was about to deliver what she thought was a hilarious punchline. Honestly, she said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes, sometimes I wish you were never born. Our childhood would have been so much more fun without you being such a buzzkill all the time. The room erupted in laughter. Dad nearly choked on his cake. Mom was giggling behind her napkin. Jessica was slapping the table. But I wasn't laughing. I put my fork down slowly, the clink of metal against china seeming abnormally loud in the midst of their hilarity. My heart was racing, pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. But I smiled. I smiled the calmest, most serene smile I'd ever managed in my life. The laughter was still echoing around the table as I looked directly at Amanda, then let my gaze sweep across each of their faces, Dad, still chuckling, Mom, wiping her eyes, Jessica, grinning widely. Then I said my one line. Well, Amanda, the feeling is mutual. The only difference is, I actually have the power to make that wish come true. The room went dead silent. The laughter died as if someone had flipped the switch. Forks stopped moving. Breathing seemed to pause. The only sound was the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I could see the confusion spreading across their faces as they processed what I'd said. The joke had been on me, as always, so why wasn't I laughing along? Why wasn't I deflecting with self-deprecating humor or changing the subject like I always did? I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I folded my napkin neatly and placed it beside my half-eaten slice of cake. Thank you for dinner, Mom. It was enlightening. I picked up my purse and walked to the front door, my heels clicking steadily on the floor. Behind me, I could hear someone call my name, I think it was Dad, but I didn't turn around. I walked out, closing the door quietly behind me, and drove home in complete silence. That night, I sat in my apartment with a cup of tea and really thought about what had happened. For the first time in my life, I'd stood up for myself. I'd refused to be the family punching bag, the reliable doormat who absorbed everyone else's cruelty with a smile. And it felt incredible. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. If I was serious about what I'd said, about having the power to make Amanda's wish come true, then I needed to follow through. I needed to actually remove myself from their lives in a way that would make them understand what they'd lost. The next morning, I started planning. First, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching job opportunities in other cities. I'd been thinking about making a change anyway, and now seemed like the perfect time. Within a week, I'd applied for teaching positions in Seattle, Portland, and Denver, all far enough away to make casual visits impossible. While I waited to hear back, I began the process of systematically removing myself from my family's life. I changed my phone number without giving them the new one. I deactivated my Facebook account. I stopped responding to emails. When Jessica called the school looking for me, I had the secretary tell her I was unavailable. When Mom showed up at my apartment, I simply didn't answer the door. 3 weeks after the dinner, I got a call from the principal at Roosevelt High School in Seattle. They wanted to interview me for a position teaching advanced English literature. The salary was better than what I was making, and they offered relocation assistance. I took the job. I gave my current school 4 weeks' notice, telling them I'd received an opportunity I couldn't pass up. My colleagues threw me a small farewell party, and several students wrote me touching thank you notes. It was the kind of warm send-off I've never received from my own family. I hired movers, forwarded my mail to a P.O. box, and within 6 weeks of that dinner, I was gone. But I wasn't just disappearing, I was transforming. In Seattle, I threw myself into my new life with an energy I hadn't felt in years. I joined a hiking group and discovered I loved being outdoors. I took a creative writing class and found I had a real talent for storytelling. I started dating again, meeting people who appreciated my quiet sense of humor and my genuine interest in others. For the first time in my adult life, I was surrounded by people who valued me. My new colleagues respected my teaching methods and sought out my advice. My students responded to my passion for literature with enthusiasm I'd rarely seen before. The hiking group welcomed me warmly, and I quickly made friends who actually enjoyed my company. I began to realize how much of my personality had been suppressed by constantly trying to fit into my family's dynamic. Without their constant subtle undermining, I flourished. I started a blog about teaching literature, and it gained a small but dedicated following. I enrolled in an online master's program in educational leadership and began working toward my degree part-time. After 3 years in Seattle, I was promoted to assistant principal, and then to full principal 2 years after that. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. For the first time in my life, I was discovering who I really was when I wasn't constantly trying to manage other people's emotions or make myself smaller to avoid conflict. I realized I was actually funny, not in a self-deprecating way, but genuinely witty. My hiking friends loved my dry observations about trail conditions and fellow hikers. My colleagues appreciated my ability to find humor in the chaos of high school drama. I'd never been allowed to be funny at home because humor was Jessica and Amanda's territory, and I'd learned early that trying to compete would only result in being shut down. I discovered I was passionate about social justice issues. I started volunteering at a local literacy center, helping adult learners improve their reading skills. I organized fundraisers for classroom supplies in underprivileged schools. I joined the local chapter of Teachers for Educational Equity. These weren't things I'd ever had time for before, when every weekend was consumed with family obligations and emotional labor. Most surprisingly, I found out I was actually quite social. Back home, I'd been labeled as the quiet one, the introvert who preferred books to people. But that had been a survival mechanism, a way to avoid drawing attention that might result in ridicule. In Seattle, surrounded by people who actually listened when I spoke and valued what I had to say, I blossomed into someone who genuinely enjoyed hosting dinner parties, organizing group outings, and building deep friendships. One evening, about 18 months after I'd moved, I was hosting a potluck dinner for my hiking group when someone made a joke about their own family drama. The group started sharing stories about difficult relatives, boundary setting, and family dysfunction. I found myself telling them about my situation, not for sympathy, but as part of a genuine conversation among equals. "Wait," said Maria, one of my favorite hiking companions, "they actually convinced you that you were adopted as a form of entertainment?" "For months," I confirmed. I was 12 and going through that awkward phase where you're already questioning everything about yourself. "That's not funny family teasing," said Tom, shaking his head. "That's psychological abuse." The word hit me like a lightning bolt. Abuse. I'd never thought of it that way. Physical abuse was hitting and screaming, wasn't it? But as my new friends talked about emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and systematic degradation, I began to see my childhood through a different lens. I started reading books about family dynamics and emotional abuse. I learned about scapegoating, golden children, and narcissistic family systems. I discovered terms like emotional parentification, which perfectly described how I'd been expected to manage everyone else's feelings while my own were dismissed. The more I read, the angrier I became. Not the desperate, powerless anger I'd felt at that dinner table, but a clean, righteous anger that burned away the last vestiges of guilt I'd been carrying about abandoning my family. I hadn't abandoned them. I'd escaped them. This revelation coincided with some interesting intelligence I was getting about their reactions to my disappearance. Through social media connections and mutual acquaintances, word was starting to filter back to me about how my absence was affecting them. It started small. My cousin Rachel mentioned in a casual Facebook comment that family gatherings were weird now. A former high school classmate told me she'd run into Jessica at the grocery store, and Jessica had seemed really stressed and kept asking if I'd heard from you. But the most revealing information came from Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor from my childhood home. She'd always been kind to me, and when she saw my name on a teaching award announcement that had been shared in the local newspaper, someone from my old school had nominated me for a state-level recognition, she sent a letter to my school, which they forwarded to me. "Sarah, dear," she wrote, "I was so proud to see your accomplishment in the paper. I always knew you were special. I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I wanted you to know that your poor mother has been asking everyone in the neighborhood if we've heard from you. She seems quite beside herself with worry. I told her I'd try to find a way to let you know she's thinking of you. I hope you're doing well, wherever you are." I stared at that email for a long time. Part of me felt a flicker of the old guilt, the trained response to put everyone else's feelings before my own. But I'd learned enough about healthy boundaries to recognize that my mother's distress was not my responsibility to fix, especially when it was the natural consequence of her own choices. I wrote back to Mrs. Patterson, thanking her for the kind words and asking her to let my mother know that I was safe and well, but that I needed space. I kept it brief and didn't explain the circumstances. Mrs. Patterson didn't need to be drawn into family drama. But Mrs. Patterson's email opened a floodgate of information. Over the next few months, she sent me periodic updates, clearly thinking she was helping facilitate some kind of reconciliation. "Your mother has started seeing a therapist," she wrote in one email. She mentioned it when she was asking me to keep an eye on her flower garden while she's at her appointments. "I saw your father at the hardware store yesterday," came another update. "He looked older, somehow. Tired. He asked me again if I'd heard anything from you." The most interesting update came about a year after I'd left. "I'm not sure what's happening with your sisters, but there seems to be some tension there. Your mother mentioned that Jessica and Amanda had a big fight at Easter dinner, something about Amanda making a comment about Jessica's parenting. Your mother seemed quite upset that you weren't there to help smooth things over." Ah. There it was. Without me to serve as their common target and emotional mediator, my sisters were turning on each other. The family dynamic that had seemed so stable with me as the designated scapegoat was falling apart without someone to blame and manage their conflicts. I found myself curious about the details but not emotionally invested in the outcome. It was like watching a TV drama about people I used to know but no longer felt connected to. The updates continued to trickle in. Amanda had apparently had some kind of breakdown and moved back in with my parents full-time. Jessica's marriage was under strain. Mark was reportedly frustrated with the amount of time Jessica was spending trying to track me down and manage the family crisis. The annual family vacation had been canceled because it didn't feel right without me there. Each piece of information confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't dared to hope: I had mattered. Despite feeling invisible and unimportant for most of my life, my absence was creating a significant void. They were finally experiencing the loss of all the emotional labor I'd provided, all the ways I'd held their dysfunction together through my own sacrifice. But the most satisfying piece of intelligence came from an unexpected source. My former colleague Mark, not Jessica's husband, a different Mark, had kept in touch with me after I moved. He taught at a high school across town from where I used to work, and our schools often collaborated on district initiatives. He called me one evening, laughing. "Sarah, you're not going to believe this. I was at a district meeting today, and your sister Jessica was there. Apparently she's married to one of the doctors who consults on our health education curriculum. Anyway, she cornered me afterward and started grilling me about whether I knew where you were." "What did you tell her?" "Nothing, obviously. But here's the interesting part, she seemed almost desperate. She kept talking about how the family wasn't the same without you, how they needed to find you to make things right. She said they'd been trying everything to locate you but had hit dead ends since you clearly made an effort to disappear." "They've been trying to find me?" I was genuinely shocked. "That seems extreme." "That's what I thought. But she kept going on about how much they missed you, how they didn't realize how important you were to the family. She actually used the phrase the glue that held us together. I wanted to ask her why they didn't appreciate the glue while they had it, but I managed to keep my mouth shut. After I hung up, I sat in my beautiful Seattle apartment, looking out at the city lights, and felt a profound sense of vindication. Jessica, successful, confident, golden child Jessica, was desperate about my absence. She'd been going to professional meetings and cornering my former colleagues. She described me as the glue that held the family together. These were words I'd never heard while I was actually there, holding them together. The irony was almost too perfect. For 32 years, I'd bent over backward trying to earn their love and recognition. I'd absorbed their cruelty, managed their emotions, and minimized my own needs in service of family harmony. And in return, I'd been treated as an afterthought, a supporting character in their more important stories. Now, by refusing to continue playing that role, I'd finally become the main character, not just in my own life, but in theirs as well. They were spending more time and energy thinking about me now than they ever had when I was actually present. It was the most elegant revenge I could have imagined, making them realize my value by removing it entirely. Meanwhile, my family was dealing with the consequences of my absence. I learned about this through my Aunt Linda, my mother's sister, who had always been kind to me and who managed to track down my new contact information. She called me about 6 months after I'd moved. "Sarah, honey, your family is worried sick about you. Your mother cries every day. She's convinced something terrible has happened." "I'm fine, Aunt Linda. Better than fine, actually." "But why won't you talk to them? They've been trying to reach you for months." I explained what had happened at the dinner, and the years of dismissal and emotional neglect that had led up to that moment. Aunt Linda listened without judgment. "I always wondered if they treated you differently," she admitted. "Your mother talks about Jessica and Amanda constantly, but she hardly ever mentions you unless I ask directly." "That's been my whole life, Aunt Linda. I was tired of being invisible." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you happy now, sweetheart?" "Happier than I've ever been." "Then I understand why you left. But your mother? She's really struggling with this." She should have thought about that before she laughed when Amanda said she wished I was never born. Over the next few years, I got updates from Aunt Linda about how my absence was affecting my family. It wasn't what I'd expected. At first, they were just confused and worried. They couldn't understand why I'd reacted so strongly to what they saw as harmless family teasing. Mom kept calling my old number, hoping I'd reconnected it. Jessica hired a private investigator to make sure I was okay. But as months turned into years, something shifted. They began to realize how much I'd actually contributed to the family dynamic. I'd been the one who organized family gatherings, remembered birthdays, mediated conflicts between my sisters, and provided emotional support to everyone. Without me, family gatherings became awkward and strained. Jessica and Amanda, without their mutual target, began turning on each other. Old resentment surfaced. Amanda felt threatened by Jessica's success, while Jessica grew tired of Amanda's inability to launch her career. Mom became depressed. She'd lost not just a daughter, but the daughter who had been most attentive to her emotional needs. I'd been the one who called regularly just to chat, who remembered her favorite flowers, who listened patiently to her worries and complaints. Dad struggled with the realization that he'd failed to protect one of his children from the others. He'd always prided himself on being a good father, but my disappearance forced him to confront the ways he'd allowed my sisters to treat me poorly. "Your mother wants to write you a letter," Aunt Linda told me during one of our conversations. "She's been working on it for months. She's welcome to try, but I don't have to read it." "Sarah, they've all changed. They're going to therapy, family therapy and individual therapy. They're trying to understand what they did wrong." I felt a flicker of something, not quite satisfaction, but vindication. They were finally taking responsibility for their behavior, but only after losing me completely. "I'm glad they're getting help, Aunt Linda. But that doesn't change what they did to me for 32 years. The third year brought even more evidence of my family's disintegration. Through Aunt Linda, I learned that Jessica and Amanda's relationship had deteriorated to the point where they could barely be in the same room together. Without me to serve as their mutual target and buffer, old resentments and competitions had surfaced with a vengeance. Jessica accused Amanda of never growing up and taking responsibility for her life, Aunt Linda reported during one of our conversations. And Amanda fired back that Jessica had always been a controlling perfectionist who looked down on everyone else. Your mother ended up crying at the dinner table because she said it reminded her of how they used to gang up on you, except now they were doing it to each other. The poetic justice of that moment wasn't lost on me. They were finally experiencing what they'd put me through, being on the receiving end of their family's casual cruelty. The difference was that they had each other to fight with, while I'd always faced their united front alone. Your father apparently tried to play peacemaker, Aunt Linda continued, but he doesn't have your gift for smoothing things over. He just made it worse by telling them they were both being childish. I almost laughed at that. Dad had never intervened when my sisters were being cruel to me, but now that their behavior was disrupting his peace, he was suddenly concerned about childish behavior. The most telling detail came from an unexpected source, Emma, Jessica's daughter, who was now 16 and had somehow found my school's contact information online. She sent a carefully written letter to my office that broke my heart and validated every decision I'd made. Dear Aunt Sarah, I don't know if you remember me, but I'm Emma, Jessica's daughter. I found your school online and hope they could forward this to you. I hope it's okay that I'm writing to you. I wanted you to know that I always thought you were cool, and I don't understand why everyone in our family treated you badly. Mom and Aunt Amanda fight all the time now, and Grandma cries a lot. Mom keeps trying to find you but doesn't know how. I just wanted you to know that not everyone in the family thought you deserved how they treated you. I hope you're happy wherever you are. I stared at that letter for hours. Emma had been just a child during most of the family gatherings where I'd been dismissed and ridiculed, but even she had noticed the dynamic. Even a teenager could see what the adults in my family had refused to acknowledge for decades. I wrote back through the school, thanking her for her kindness and telling her I was indeed very happy. I encouraged her to focus on her own goals and dreams, and to remember that she deserved to be treated with respect and kindness. I didn't badmouth her mother or aunt, but I hoped she'd internalize the message about self-worth. The conversation with Emma sparked something in me, a realization that my disappearance wasn't just affecting my parents and sisters, but the next generation too. Emma was growing up watching the adults in her family deal with the consequences of their emotional cruelty, and hopefully learning some lessons about how not to treat people. Around the same time, Mrs. Patterson sent me another letter with some interesting news. She'd apparently become something of a neighborhood gossip hub, and my family seemed to confide in her regularly. Your sister Amanda has been having a difficult time, she wrote. I saw her at the grocery store last week and she looked quite thin and tired. She mentioned she's been seeing a counselor and doing a lot of inner work, as she called it. She asked me again if I'd heard from you, and when I said no, she started crying right there in the produce section. She said she'd been thinking a lot about how she treated you growing up, and she wished she could take it all back. Mrs. Patterson's letters continued over the following months, each one providing more evidence of my family's ongoing struggles with my absence. Amanda's therapy seemed to be helping her realize the extent of the damage she'd caused, but the realization was clearly devastating her. She's been asking your mother to give her your old things from your bedroom, came one update. Your mother said Amanda just sits there going through your old books and school papers, crying. It's quite heartbreaking to watch, really. It would have been validating if it wasn't so frustrating. Where was this remorse when I needed it? Where was this emotional awareness when I was 12 years old, believing I might actually be adopted because my own sisters had convinced me I didn't belong? But the most revealing letter came about 2 years after Emma had first contacted me. I ran into Amanda at the coffee shop yesterday, and she looks much better, healthier, more put together. She's apparently gotten a job at a local art therapy center and seems to be doing well. But when I mentioned how nice it was to see her thriving, she got very sad and said that her biggest regret was that she couldn't share her progress with you. She said she's learned so much about herself and about the damage that cruel words can do, but that she knows it's too late to make amends. She said she understands now that some people leave our lives because we've hurt them too deeply, and that sometimes the loving thing to do is to let them go. Reading that, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. There was validation in knowing Amanda finally understood the impact of her behavior. But there was also sadness for the relationship we might have had if she'd been capable of this level of self-reflection years earlier. I shared Mrs. Patterson's letter with my therapist during our next session. How does it feel to hear about her growth secondhand like this? Dr. Martinez asked. Honestly? It feels too little, too late, I said after thinking about it. I'm glad she's working on herself, but it doesn't change what she did to me for 32 years. What would the actual work look like to you? I don't know. Maybe focusing on being a better person to the people currently in her life instead of mourning the relationship she destroyed with me. Maybe learning to treat other people with kindness and respect instead of using them as emotional punching bags. Dr. Martinez nodded. It sounds like you're clear about your boundaries and realistic about what her posts do and don't mean for your own healing. I was clear about my boundaries. And as my new life continued to flourish, I found myself thinking less and less about my family. I was building something beautiful and meaningful, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than tolerating me out of obligation. I met David in my 5th year in Seattle. He was a librarian with a gentle sense of humor and a genuine appreciation for literature. He thought my stories about my students were fascinating rather than boring. He listened when I talked about my work, asked thoughtful questions, and celebrated my successes with genuine pride. When I told him about my family situation, he was supportive but not pushy. "Do you miss them?" he asked. "I miss the idea of having a loving family," I admitted. "But I don't miss the reality of how they treated me." "That makes sense. You can grieve the family you should have had while still protecting yourself from the family you actually had." David understood me in ways my biological family never had. When we got engaged after 3 years together, I realized that I was about to have the wedding I'd always dreamed of, surrounded by people who truly loved and supported me. Through Aunt Linda, I heard that my family had learned about my engagement through a mutual acquaintance who'd seen the announcement in the Seattle newspaper. Mom had apparently locked herself in her room and cried for 3 days. "She keeps saying she'll never see you in a wedding dress, never meet your children, never be able to make things right," Aunt Linda reported. I felt a pang of something, not exactly sadness, but a kind of hollow ache for what could have been. If they had treated me with love and respect from the beginning, Mom would have been the first person I called with my engagement news. She would have helped me plan the wedding, fussed over details, cried happy tears when I walked down the aisle. But that wasn't the relationship we'd ever had, and it was too late to build it now. The wedding was beautiful. My hiking friends were my bridesmaids. My department colleagues came and celebrated with genuine joy. David's family welcomed me warmly, and I finally understood what it felt like to be part of a loving, supportive family system. As I walked down the aisle, I thought briefly about the empty chairs where my parents and sisters should have been sitting. But the thought was fleeting, replaced by gratitude for all the people who were there, who had chosen to love me and celebrate this moment with me. After the honeymoon, David and I settled into married life. I continued my work as principal and finished my master's degree in educational leadership. David got promoted to head librarian. We bought a house, adopted 2 rescue dogs, and started talking about children. Life was good. Life was better than I'd ever imagined it could be. It was 8 years after the dinner when the letter finally arrived. I almost threw it away without reading it. The return address was my childhood home, the handwriting my mother's familiar script. But David encouraged me to at least see what she had to say. The letter was 12 pages long, handwritten on Mom's good stationery. It was an apology, but not the shallow, excuse-making kind I might have expected. It was raw, honest, and devastating in its self-awareness. She wrote about how she'd failed me as a mother, how she'd allowed my sisters to bully me without consequence, how she'd minimized my feelings and dismissed my needs. She acknowledged that she'd played favorites, that she'd been so focused on managing Jessica's intensity and Amanda's neediness that she'd neglected the daughter who never demanded attention. She wrote about the therapy sessions where she'd been forced to confront her own childhood trauma, how her own mother had ignored her in favor of her more demanding siblings, and how she'd unconsciously perpetuated that pattern with her own children. She wrote about Dad's guilt, how he'd realized he'd been a passive enabler of the family dynamic, failing to protect me when he should have stepped in. She wrote about Jessica's shock when the therapist helped her understand how her competitive nature had contributed to my marginalization, and about Amanda's gradual recognition that her jokes had been cruel rather than harmless. Most importantly, she wrote about how much they all miss me, not just as the family mediator and caretaker, but as a person. She shared specific memories I'd forgotten, how I comforted her after her father's death, how I'd helped Jessica study for the bar exam, how I'd encouraged Amanda during her darkest period of depression. "We didn't value you when we had you," she wrote. "We took you for granted, treated you as if you were less important than your sisters, and allowed a family culture where hurting you was acceptable. I understand now why you left, and I don't blame you for it. You deserve better than we gave you." The letter ended with a simple request: "I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect you to come back. I just want you to know that we love you, we're sorry, and we understand that we lost the right to be part of your life. If you ever decide you want contact with us again, we'll be here. If not, we'll respect that too. I just needed you to know that Amanda was wrong. We're all incredibly grateful that you were born, and we're sorry it took losing you for us to realize it." I cried reading that letter. Not tears of reconciliation or forgiveness, but tears of grief for the relationship we'd never had and now never would. David held me while I cried, and we talked long into the night about what the letter meant and how I felt about it. "Do you want to reconnect with them?" he asked. "Part of me does," I admitted. "But I'm not the same person who left that dinner table 6 years ago. I've built a life here, with people who value me. I can't go back to being the family scapegoat, even if they promise to do better." "You don't have to make any decisions right now," David said gently. "You can sit with this for as long as you need to." Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking more about my family than I had in years. The letter had cracked something open in me, not a desire to reconcile, exactly, but a kind of closure I hadn't realized I needed. I talked to my therapist. Yes, I'd started therapy too, to help process my childhood experiences and build healthier relationship patterns. She helped me understand that I could acknowledge their growth and apologize while still maintaining my boundaries. In the end, I decided to write back. Not to reconcile, but to close this chapter properly. My letter was much shorter than Mom's. I thanked her for the apology and acknowledged the work they'd all done to understand their behavior. I told her I was proud of them for getting help and hoped they'd continue to build healthier relationships with each other. But I also made it clear that too much damage had been done for us to have a relationship now. I built a new life, found my own family, and learned to value myself in ways they'd never taught me to. I wasn't angry anymore, but I also wasn't interested in going backward. I forgive you, I wrote, but forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. I hope you can understand that sometimes loving someone means letting them go. I sent the letter and felt a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying finally lift from my shoulders. That was 3 years ago. I'm 41 now, still happily married to David, still loving my career as a principal, still surrounded by people who appreciate me for who I am. We had our first baby 18 months ago, a beautiful daughter we named Hope. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like if my family could meet her, if she could have grandparents and aunts who loved her. But then I remember that she will grow up knowing she's valued, knowing her voice matters, knowing she deserves to be treated with respect and kindness. She'll never wonder if she belongs or doubt her worth because of cruel family jokes. That's worth more than any relationship with people who only learned to value me after I was gone. Amanda was wrong that night 11 years ago when she said she wished I was never born. I was born, and I mattered, and I deserved better than they gave me. It just took me 32 years and one perfectly delivered comeback to realize it. They thought the joke was on me when everyone laughed at that dinner table. But the real joke was on them. They lost the best daughter they had, and they didn't even realize it until it was too late. I walked out of that dining room, and I never looked back. And that, as it turns out, was the best decision I ever made.